All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, I'm Andrew, aka Postmodern Mindgasms. And for the purposes of this video, that's my name. And so, I'm going to do another video in my series that I've been doing on Michel Foucault's book called History of Sexuality. And he was, of course, a French post-structuralist philosopher who wrote primarily in the 70s. And public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay have been strawmanning their arguments for a long time. So I wanted to do deep dive videos into some of the work of the so-called postmodern philosophers like Foucault and Derrida. And Foucault is my favorite, and History of Sexuality is my favorite book by him. So again, going to continue this series today and talk about Foucault's thoughts in terms of history, psychology, and culture, in terms of what he sees as four different figures that were constructed by the institutions of science and religion during the Enlightenment, that are hysterical women, masturbating children, breeding couples, and perverted adults. So I'm going to talk about this because it's related to some things that have been going on recently. So again, of course, one of those that's been happening recently in terms of hysterical women has been all of this stuff to do with the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard trial, where she's apparently done some crazy fucking shit like shat on his bed, and people have made these probably bullshit conspiratorial rumors about her doing coke in court and shit like that. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of this here. I know a lot of you have probably heard a lot about it before, so I'm just going to play a few minutes of this crazy shit. This video is very biased, so keep that in mind. So basically, they see her as evil and him as unquestionably good, but she did some pretty fucking crazy.
I'm sorry that I didn't hit you
me
across the face in a proper slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
At this point in the case, we can all tell that Amber is a little bit psycho. Here she is admitting that she didn't punch Johnny but hit him instead, so according to her, it's justifiable to hit someone so long as you don't punch them. She also refers to the fact that Depp is old by telling him, yeah, I know you've been around long.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
You know, even a lot of fights been around a long time. I know. Yeah,
no, when you fucking have a closed fist.
You get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you.
If that's the case, who hits old people? She's been shedding tears and faking bruises when she was the one hitting Johnny and justifying it to the fact that he's fine.
I'm not sitting here bitching about it, am I? You are.
Okay, well, yeah, you know about all that stupid shit that's going on. But this basically relates to what Foucault talks about in terms of the subject of the hysterical woman and the sexualization of women during the Enlightenment by the institutions of science and religion. So this is what he says about, quote unquote, the hysterization of women's bodies. A hysterization of women's bodies, a threefold process whereby the feminine body was analyzed, qualified, and disqualified as being thoroughly saturated with sexuality. So everything to do with women is sexualized in the way they interact with culture, whereby it was integrated into the sphere of medical practices by reason of pathology intrinsic to it. So pathological sexuality determined by the medical industry, whereby finally it was placed in organic communication with the social body whose regulated fecundity it was supposed to ensure, the family space of which it had to be substantial and functional element. So even in the family space, like even with her children, a woman has to be sexualized pathologically. And the life of children, which it produced and had to guarantee by virtue of a biological moral responsibility. He just means biology and morality combined. Responsibility lasting through the entire period of the children's education. The mother, with her negative image of quote-unquote nervous woman, constituted the most visible form of this hysterization. So, the part of the idea of the woman being hysterical, which used to be a diagnosable medical condition, was part of it had to do with how her pathological sexuality that was inlaid into all of her interactions with people in her culture has made her hysterical. She's so sexualized that she's crazy. That's basically this idea of Foucault. So also another subject that he talks about is children, the sexualization of children through the institutions of science and religion, particularly science, during the Enlightenment, and how they were never seen as sexualized figures before. But then these ideas of masturbation and sexualization were attached to children. So this relates to this whole scandal with that movie Cuties that came out on Netflix about a year ago, right? It's about this kid who gets into dancing, and then they do this whole sexualized dancing, and that's what pissed off a bunch of people. Some people got hysterical, quote unquote, themselves about it, but it's justified to be pissed off about that, I think, to an extent at least. So I'll share a little bit of this trailer here for Cuties, and then get into what Foucault says about the sexualization of children.
Mais qu'est-ce que c'est que ça? Il se passe quoi
I don't know
là?
if you guys can see that. Can you guys see those subtitles in French? What's going on? Yeah, you can see them.
Vous faisiez quoi la gare?
On va danser au concours.
She's going to the dance tournament.
Putain, ça avec vous. Quoi?
Yeah, that's enough. Like you already see the children like sexualizing themselves a little bit. Obviously, it's not as bad, at least in the trailer, as some people say it is, but it obviously gets into, like little girls dancing all sexually and stuff like that. And this was a thing that happened during the Enlightenment. Children were not looked at sexually before the Enlightenment. Okay, so this is what Foucault says about the sexualization of children. And so he calls this a pedagogization of children's sex. A double assertion that practically all children indulge or are prone to indulge in sexual activity, and that being unwarranted, so all children are prone to indulge in sexual activity. As he gets on with this, he means kind of like sexual exploration, like realizing that you have a penis and stuff like that, and masturbation if you're a man, or realizing you have a vagina and masturbating if you're a girl. He doesn't mean like children having sex with each other. So prone to indulge in sexual activity, and that being unwarranted at the same time, quote unquote, natural and quote unquote, contrary to nature. This sexual activity poses physical and moral, individual and collective dangers. So it's natural, but bad. It's morally bad sexualized behavior of children, but it's natural. But so this basically relates to how the sexual behavior of children is basically the equivalent of original sin, and it's a diagnosable problem because the institutions of science and religion created these concepts during the Enlightenment that children are naturally prone to behaving in these bad sexualized ways. Children were defined as quote-unquote preliminary sexual beings on this side of sex, yet within it astride a dangerous dividing line. Parents, families, educators, doctors, and eventually psychologists would have to take charge in a continuous way of this precious and perilous, dangerous and endangered sexual potential. Dangerous and endangered simultaneously, right? This pedagogization was especially evident in the war against onanism, which in the West lasted nearly 2 centuries. So I had to look up that word because I didn't realize what that meant, but it makes sense after I looked it up that he would use the word onanism in the context of what he's talking about there with the sexualization of children, because as you can see here, hopefully you can see that if onanism basically means masturbation, or if you're using in the biblical sense, which makes sense because Foucault's talking about the power of religion in shaping the way that we look at concepts like sexualization of children in our culture. So onanism biblically basically means both masturbation and unnatural intercourse between a man and woman. So anything defined as unnatural sexual behavior too. So it makes sense that Foucault would use that word, right? So basically, this he says the pedagogization was especially evident in the war against onanism, which in the West lasted nearly 2 centuries. The war against quote unquote unnatural sexual behavior and masturbation. So the institutions of science and religion determined that little boys and girls naturally sexualize themselves, but this is also an inherent problem, a medical/psychological flaw, and an original religious sin. It's natural that women and children behave hysterically for women and in sexualized ways for both women and children. So I'm going to get more into what Foucault says here about procreation and perverse pleasure. So this is a basically just a video that someone is doing talking about perversion in terms of Foucault's term from History of Sexuality called the perverse implantation. So I'm just going to go through a few minutes of this one here and then get into what Foucault says about it specifically. Okay.
So today we're going to be talking about Michel Foucault's The Perverse Implantation, which is a chapter from his book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which came out in 1976. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to explain to you a little bit about Foucault's book and the points that he's making in this chapter. And then at the end, I'm going to give you the framework for what you're supposed to be doing on Facebook for the weekly assignment, the bi-weekly assignment, that is. Okay, so here we go. Okay. So Michel Foucault was a French philosopher and historian. And what he's primarily interested in is examining power and the history of power and how power affects society. And that is something that he does in his book, The History of Sexuality, which is not from the Victorian period, but is about the 1700s and the 1800s, and the different ways in which new ideas of sexuality about that time, that arose during that time, functioned as a form of power over the general population. And I'll explain what that means. In the section that you read for today, he's focusing on what is new and unique in the social discourse about sexuality in the 1700s and through the 1800s, so the period that we're studying. Okay? And something that he's interested in is the historical shift from an obsession before the 1700s with marital versus non-marital sexualities. So what he identifies is that when you look at religion and when you look at legal codes before the 1700s, what they're most obsessed with actually is marital sexuality. So in other words, what husbands and wives can and cannot do with each other within their marriage, right? Obviously, there's a condemnation of sex that happens outside of marriage, but there's not really an interest in defining all the different types of non-marital sexualities that can exist. So in other words, same-sex sexuality and adultery and bestiality and masturbation are not really sharply delineated from each other, not really sharply separate from each other. They're just lumped into this one big broad category of just like sex outside of marriage. Okay, and well,
okay, that's interesting. So anything that's sex outside of marriage was determined as bad up into this point in history, but it was all lumped together. So masturbation, bestiality, cheating on your wife or a husband, all of this stuff was just in the broad category of sex outside of marriage, as he said. So during the Enlightenment was when specifically the institutions, according to this guy's reading of Foucault at least, specifically the institution of science and psychiatry in the medical industry decided to delineate all of these separate types of sexuality So they created these new categories that put people into them that they cannot escape from, because they're clearly defined as this. Like, bestiality is a separate thing from cheating on your wife and masturbation, but they're all different, and they're all problems just as much. They're no less problems from each other. Bestiality is seen as just as morally bad as cheating on your wife or husband or masturbating, and masturbation is seen as bad as bestiality, even though they're obviously different in degrees. They're seen as medically and psychologically pathological, and also religious moral sins too.
And while culturally those things are like great to do, really the culture is more obsessed with what happens between husbands and wives in marriage. What Foucault notes is that beginning in the 1700s and then really picking up into the 1800s, rather than being worried about marital versus non-marital sexualities, there becomes an obsession of natural versus unnatural sexualities. And that comes about, it's no coincidence, with the rise of science and scientists and medical doctors starting to declare their authority over human sexuality over religion. Okay? So before the 1700s, religion is really kind of dictating the cultural discourse on sexuality. Starting in the 1700s and 1800s, it's science and medicine. And they start getting really obsessed with trying to define what is a natural form of sexuality and what kinds of sexuality are unnatural. And there becomes a lot less interest in marital sexualities and what happens between husbands. There's much more cultural interest in.
Okay, so yeah, he makes some interesting points about what Foucault says about these sexual categories in terms of perversion. So basically, also still during the Enlightenment, anything within a marriage, and procreation in particularly, is seen as very inherently good. And basically, so all of these sexual behaviors that he was talking about, these are bad because they don't have to do with procreation. And the institutions of science and religion declared that these forms, like specifically, obviously bestiality is more fucked up than cheating on your wife or masturbating. But they're not. It's a form of sex that neglects procreation. Therefore, they're a religious sin, and they're pathologically, psychologically, and medically flawed. So this is what Foucault says about a socialization of procreative behavior. An economic socialization via all the incitements and restrictions. The quote-unquote social and fiscal measures brought to bear on the fertility of couples. A political socialization achieved through the quote-unquote responsibilization of couples with regard to the social body as a whole, which had to be limited or, on the contrary, reinvigorated. And a medical, so basically couples have to breed. That's what society says in the Enlightenment, and the institutions of society, of religion and science that decide what is moral in the society declared this, basically. Had to be limited or, on the contrary, reinvigorated. And a medical socialization carried out by attributing a pathogenic value for the individual and the species to birth control practices. I thought this was interesting and also relevant to all of the recent abortion scandal stuff, with Roe versus Wade getting overturned by, it being leaked that it's extremely likely that Roe versus Wade will be overturned by the American Supreme Court this July. And it sparked a whole controversy because that's really fucked up, in my opinion. But I thought this was interesting because, and I had to look up the word pathogenic too, because I forgot what that meant. So I think that's really interesting because he talks about a pathogenic value attributed to birth control. And pathogenic, if you can see, I don't know if you can see here, basically means of a bacterium, virus, or other microorganisms causing disease. So basically, the institutions of science and religion moralized against birth control so much, to the point that they spread this propaganda that birth control causes disease. So the institutions of science and religion during the Enlightenment declared that birth control is bad. Birth control is bad, and it's a sinful and it's sinful, and it's a psychological flaw because it prevents the supposedly natural need for couples to breed, because procreation is apparently just inherently natural. Okay, so I'm going to okay, finish that one there. Okay, so that's what Foucault says about the socialization of procreative behavior. It's been socialized to be it was socialized to be seen as morally good and religiously and scientifically good. Okay, so I'm going to play here also what Slavoj Žižek, who I've talked with about a few times on my channel before, who is a Hegelian, Lacanian Marxist who has some really interesting philosophical opinions about various subjects. I'm going to play what he says about hysteria and perversion, and he mentions Foucault a little bit too. And I'll stop it at some point here because he speaks so quickly and goes all over the place, and he just basically gets completely off topic at one point, so I'll have to stop it eventually because he talks really quickly in a long stream. All right, so do this. Oh shit, that's not what I meant to do.
We live in a unique era where today, if we can construct this in a naive way, I simplify it. Today, ideology, and I don't mean a personalized ideology, but in the most elementary sense, when you're growing up and all the time later, what society is telling you to be?
Oh shit.
In a very naive way. What does it expect from you? My God, it's no longer obey your father.
Shit, sorry. I forgot I was playing that at 2x speed. I'm going to put that back at normal speed and restart it here. I'm watching everything at 2x speed nowadays.
We live in a unique era where today, if we can construct this in a naive way, I simplify it. Today, ideology, and I don't mean a personalized ideology, but in the most elementary sense, when you're growing up and all the time later, what society is telling you to be in a very naive way? What does it expect from you? My God, it's no longer obey your father, sacrifice yourself. It's what I ironically like to call spiritualized hedonism or enlightened Western Buddhism. Basically, the message is there are no higher causes worth sacrificing for. Enjoy life, but not in a stupid sense. Look into yourself, recreate yourself, explore your potentials, and so on and so on. Sometimes this also has very comic effects. For example, recently, not so recently, years ago, I was in Argentina, and I was told there a wonderful story from a historian of psychoanalysis, how things changed, because as Foucault, I don't agree with him, I'm not a Foucauldian, but he's not an idiot. One should read him. So
There you go,
Michel Foucault noticed in a very nice way somewhere how the key decision, power decision of a psychoanalyst is what is a symptom that has to be analyzed as a clinical case, and what is just a normal state that doesn't deserve to be analyzed. You know, somebody comes to you, if you are an analyst, I am not, and you can guess why. Once a student, this is not a joke, unfortunately. Once a student in New York told me, I would like to go to you in psychoanalysis. My idea was, you are really mad. Okay, but seriously, they told me that a very simple, stupid example. Half a century ago and more, a very traditional, stupid point, simplistic, with regard to promiscuity. If you were a man or a wife, promiscuous, sleeping around with others, it was considered pathological, something to be interpreted. You know, the idea was, what are you running from? Why this fear from stable relations, whatever? Did you have Oedipal problems, blah, blah. Today, they told me it's the opposite. I'm not joking. If you are faithful to your wife or husband, you'll get, oh my God, you have a traumatic fixation. This has to be... things. So you know what's the first lesson here? That it's not just a stupid game of words. Hysteria is historical. Forms of hysteria are always historically specified.
So the concept of hysteria is constructed, socially constructed, historically throughout history by whatever culture you're living in, right? Because the institutions of science and religion created this idea of hysteria and women becoming hysterical and that being linked to their inherent pathological sexuality that leaks into all aspects of the way they live their lives in their culture.
In what sense? In the sense that hysteria is, my old Lacanian and at the same time Marxian thesis, hysteria is the elementary form of critique of ideology. Critique at ideology at its most elementary subjective level.
Slavoj Žižek always has interesting thoughts about ideology, and hystericization or hysteria is a form of rebellion against ideologies. That's a very interesting Slavoj Žižek idea.
Because as you already, I think, indicated, incidentally, I will not go into it, but that's what nonetheless makes me some kind, at least I hope, some kind of a feminist, because hysteria is feminine. If you want this opposition in types of pathology, obsessional neurosis is more masculine. There are even among some clinicians that I know great debates of can there be even a feminine obsessional neurotic? But what I want to say is, what is hysteria at its most elementary? It's an undermining of interpellation. By interpellation, I mean this mechanism elaborated by Louis Althusser of ideological identity, like society or figures of authority are telling you who you are, your symbolic identity. You are my wife, you are professor, you are pupil, you are revolutionary, you are a communist, whatever.
Yeah, he gets way more into this, so I'll stop that there, but check out the rest of that clip. It's very interesting. But yeah, that makes sense. You know, you're told your role in society, in this culture, influenced by the Enlightenment, by the through the institutions of science and religion. They like, it's not like a centrally planned economy or anything like that in the way that the government is explicitly giving you a job that you have to do. But it's that culture is dictating these roles for us that are very hard to question at all, even let alone get out of. So this is what Foucault says about perversion. A psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. The sexual instinct was isolated as a separate biological and physical instinct. A clinical analysis was made of all the forms of anomalies by which it could be afflicted. A clinical analysis of sexuality. It was assigned a role of a clinical analysis of perversion, rather. It was assigned a role of normalization or pathologization. And then there's this false dichotomy in there too. Foucault talks about all these false dichotomies created by the institutions. This is the, like, what is declared to be normal and abnormal and or natural versus unnatural sexual behavior, rather, is dictated by the institutions of science and religion. And this is like a false dichotomy because these labels change throughout time too, in the same way that normalization or pathologization is a false dichotomy. This is normal or this is pathological. So women are inherently pathologically hysterical because they're so fucking sexualized it makes them crazy, and children are just drawn to playing with themselves sexually, which is pathological, and perversion is pathological, and couples breeding and procreation is natural, because the institutions of science and religion declared this during the Enlightenment. They declared that this is true, therefore it is true. It was assigned a role of normalization or pathologization with respect to all behavior. And finally, a corrective technology was sought for these anomalies. So then Foucault gets into what basically his way of summing up his assessment of this. 4 figures emerged from this preoccupation with sex, which mounted throughout the 19th century. 4 privileged objects of knowledge, which were also targets and anchorage points for the figures we were talking about, right? Like Amber Heard is the most well-known example of this basically incorrect stereotype of women being hysterical. The masturbating child, this stereotype during the Enlightenment in that, oh no, children are being all sexual and this is very bad and unnatural. The Malthusian couple, I had to look up that word again because I've heard it before, but I forgot what it meant. So Malthusian, basically when you look it up, it has the most literal definition of relating to Malthus, or Malthus rather, or to his theory that population tends to increase at a faster rate than its means of subsistence, and that unless it is checked by moral restraint or by disease, famine, war, or other disaster, widespread poverty and degradation inevitably result. So that if the population increases so quickly that eventually runs out of resources, essentially. I think it basically, just to oversimplify, by Malthusian in this context, he just means like the breeding couple doing the thing that is normal, that they're supposed to do as dictated by the institutions of science and religion during the Enlightenment. So the figures are the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the Malthusian couple, and the perverse adult. So anything that is declared to be abnormal sexual behavior is perversion. So bestiality is perverse. I would agree with that, but our culture basically told me and all of us that that's normal. If it were normal, if everyone did it, we wouldn't consider it to be weird. I'm not, by the way, saying I'm pro bestiality and we should go out fucking animals. That's pretty fucked up in my opinion. But I acknowledge that I have this idea because it's weird in our culture, in modern Western culture, and maybe it has been throughout human history. Who knows? Anyway, so these 4 figures, the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the Malthusian couple, and the perverse adult, each of them corresponded to one of these strategies, which each in its own way invested and made use of the sex of women, children, and men. Okay, so anyway, yeah, I've been going through that for long enough. Again, I think this is another really cool and interesting deep dive into some of Foucault's thoughts from his book, History of Sexuality, in terms of history, culture, psychology, and how the institutions of science and religion during the Enlightenment created these concepts and these figures of the hysterical woman through the sexualization of women by the institutions of science and religion, and declaring certain sexual behaviors as natural and others as unnatural, and that some behaviors are religiously and morally good and others are inherent original religious sins, and then there are pathological, medical, and psychological sexual behaviors, and then there are natural ones. So other than the hysterical woman, of course, there's the figure of the masturbating child, or aka the sexualized child, and then also the breeding couple, as I call them, or the Malthusian couple, as Foucault calls them, and then the perverted adult, or the adult who does anything that's regarded as abnormal sexual behavior. Like in today's day and age, if you cheat on your wife or husband, or if you masturbate, this is basically, you're labeled as a pervert. In today's day and age, people kind of acknowledge that everyone masturbates, but through the Enlightenment was when this was first considered to be basically bad. Essentially, you're a pervert if you masturbate. So underlying message for me of all this is, we're all perverts. Embrace your perversion. Let your freak flag fly. All right. So anyway, this is Foucault's interesting thoughts on the sexualization of women and children, the socialization of breeding being good, and the psychiatrization of so-called perversion being bad. Hope you liked my exploration of these concepts. Look forward to more videos. Check out my other videos in this series. More to come. I'm only about halfway through the book, and I'm doing slow deep dives. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for watching. Click that like button. Click the bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Probably this week, I'm going to be doing my debate with my Jordan Peterson fan friends about my harsh disagreements with Jordan Peterson on the supposed existence of God, the supposed fundamental flaws of atheism, and also specifically with my Christian Jordan Peterson fan friend about whether abortion and masturbation are murder, which is also interesting and relevant to the Foucault stuff, and especially in terms of the recent news about the Roe versus Wade likely being overturned in the US. And also next weekend, I'm probably going to do a movie chat with my friends Dusty, Chris, and Shizan, who often talk with me about movies, about the movie Taxi Driver, one of the earliest movies by Martin Scorsese in the 70s, in which Robert De Niro, of course, plays a disillusioned PTSD Vietnam vet who starts driving a taxi, gradually goes crazy, gets rejected by a woman, plans to assassinate a politician, pussies out, and then kills the pimp of an underage prostitute because he needs to be violent because he's been so fucked up by the Vietnam War. And yeah, check out all that. Check out past ones. Check out the my last trailer I did for the my reaction and analysis to the new trailer for Avatar 2 that's going to come out. And yeah, check out my the link for my Patreon page. The link is in the description. As always, $1 a month, 10, 100,000, any amount you want to give me is greatly appreciated. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And Foucault is awesome. His writing is very abstract, verbose, and complex and confusing sometimes, but he makes some very interesting, salient, and radical points that I think make a lot of sense. So check out his writing and try to learn more about it. Don't listen to people like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay about it. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And yeah, Foucault is awesome. Let your perversion and your freak flag fly. We're all perverts. Enjoy life. And adios until next time.